Hello everybody and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce in Singapore webcast. It's our first webcast that we've done in the Energy and Utilities group this year on decarbonising shipping. It's April the 22nd and it's Earth Day, and a little bit more on what the Chamber's doing around Earth Day a bit later on. First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Fry Group for their continued sponsorship of our activities. I'd also like to thank the various committees. This is a joint event by the Energy and Utilities Business Committee, the Transport, Logistics and Supply Chain, and the Sustainability and Responsibility Committee. So with that, I'm going to introduce the speakers to you that you should be able to see on your screen. You'll see there that we have Douglas Raitt, who is from Lloyd's Register. He's an expert in fuels and shipping. We have Vandana, who is expert on oil markets, and we'll be talking about what's happening there. It's another headwind that's hitting the sector. And also to Mohindru from S&P Global Platts. And I'm sure that you'll recognize Samir from, you've probably received his emails in the past as well. So what's happening on Earth Day? Today, the Chamber is launching its net zero pathway, and you'll see in the top right-hand corner of your screen our new logo, which is reflecting all of the activities that the Chamber will be doing around the path to net zero. This was originally planned because the UK is co-hosting the next COP. That's obviously been postponed, but it's important as a Chamber, we all thought that we start on this pathway. So we're going to be focusing on the medium and longer term drivers for decarbonising shipping. And we're also going to be talking about the impacts of the oil markets, another headwind that's hitting this sector and many others. So we're going to look at the future as to kind of what will ships fuel look like. Now, originally this was going to be an IMO 2020 update. We did a seminar last year on the pathway to IMO 2020, which got a lot of interest from you. But IMO 2020 obviously now been introduced from 1st of January, but IMO has got a new strategy. And it's a strategy of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050, with a strong emphasis by many countries on reducing this to 100%. That's 100% by 2050 where possible. Now, this is all around carbon intensity of the transportation of goods. 90% of world trade is transported by shipping, and as demand for shipping continues to grow, another way of looking at this is reduction in carbon intensity. So we're going to be looking at that. One of the things that we will hear from panelists later on is that the overarching solution is ending of fossil fuels, requiring commercially viable zero-emission vehicles, they're called ZEVs, to enter service by 2030. We're also going to give consideration as to how ships are financed, designed and built in the 2020s, and what needs to happen around operations up to 2030 to make this 2050 target viable. So we're going to be looking around infrastructure, around the supply chain, and what this means. Now, some house rules. You can ask questions, and you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please ask those questions. If you want to make it anonymous, just write anon. But if you want to be quoted, you can write your name next to the question. This webinar is also done in conjunction, you'll see there, with the Energy Institute, and we aim to cover a whole bunch of topics. Following this webinar, BritCham members will be invited to Energy Institute events, which will be run, focusing on technology, shipping, community readiness, data and cybersecurity, investment and finance readiness, and the future of autonomous shipping, among other topics. So please look out for those. With that, I want to move on straight away and go straight into a session with Doug. And Doug's going to give an introduction, and he's got a slide for us as well. So over to you, Douglas. Douglas, you're on mute.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar, which I certainly find is a very interesting and compelling time to do so. We all know that we've just gone through the challenges of 2020, which in hindsight probably did not prove to be as challenging as we might have thought going into 2020. So now it's really looking about ahead, what is the next challenge? And the next challenge clearly is decarbonisation of the industry. And as Tim mentioned earlier on, decarbonisation really centres around how can we reduce carbon intensity in the shipping industry. And it's kind of interesting to understand that carbon intensity is not a luxury. It is not something that will go away. They are absolute. So if you really look at the context of reducing the aggregate CO2 or greenhouse gas output from shipping, we are looking at how much CO2 per ton nautical mile of goods carried can we reduce to achieve that aggregate goal. So carbon intensity is here to stay. And it is not a silver bullet solution. We can't just say, okay, LNG is the fuel of the future, ammonia is the fuel of the future, bio is the fuel of the future. There is no silver bullet. And the reality of it is that the marine readiness for decarbonisation is an interplay between technology readiness, investment readiness, and community readiness. And I'll briefly go through the three pivots in turn to give you an understanding what that really means on how shipping should think about the decarbonisation challenge. So technology readiness is really about, is the fuel available? Do we have the technology and systems for ships to burn this fuel to achieve a lower carbon intensity of the industry? And that's kind of the operating envelope of the ship. But actually technology readiness goes above and beyond shipping. It's a societal infrastructure challenge that needs to be met. It's all good and well to say we want X fuel or X synthetic fuel or renewable fuel. But if the infrastructure is not there to produce it, store it, and deliver it to shipping, it will be a challenge. So technology readiness is not only about the technology and the fuel being able to be consumed by ships, but the actual entire infrastructure to deliver. Moving on to investment readiness, the reality of it is shipping cannot, based on normal BAU economics, move to a less carbon intense future. The total life cycle costs of a zero or low emissions vessel fuel is 2 to 3 times higher than that of a conventional fossil fuel propelled ship. So that means that shipping cannot just, based on economics, say, okay, let's use ammonia as a fuel because that will work, because the reality of it is it will be much more expensive to build such a vessel and much more expensive to operate such a vessel. So in the investment readiness sphere, we have to see the development of a carbon cost on fossil fuel. So a market-based measure to plug the gap between the BAU fossil fueled vessels versus the new fuel propelled vessels. And then finally, community readiness. Whatever fuel shipping or the wider society chooses as a means to decarbonize will have to be accepted by society as a whole. So for example, take biofuels. Yes, technology available, readily available in most ports, investment pretty much okay in that sphere, but the community might longer term say, well, hang on, what fuel is shipping using? Is it really sustainable? Are we taking the biomaterials from such sources as the food supply chain, for example? So all levers in this equation, technology readiness, investment readiness, and community readiness, all have to be positive in order to achieve an overall application in the marine industry. And if we can get all of these levers right and understand the impacts on them, that will bring us a clear path forward. And to go back to my earlier point, a single silver bullet fuel solution does not exist. What might look attractive today might be less attractive in 10, 15 years. So whatever designs and technology developments we do, we must bear in mind that we need to be able to be flexible and adaptable and change from certain fuels to another over the life cycle of a vessel. And with that, Tim, I'd hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Douglas, for that great introduction and that great slide from Lloyd's Register, which really sums up the key things that we'll be talking around as we get into the conversation a little bit later on. I'd like to introduce now Vandana Harry. Vandana is the CEO of Vanda Insights. Now, there was an awful lot of talk about oil markets last year in the run-up, not just in the downstream and availability of fuels, but potential on crude prices as well. And of course, now we're in another oil price headwind. So Vandana has got some slides to explain some of that to us. And so over to you, Vandana.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining in. I'll draw your attention to the slide on the screen right now. This is the price of Brent, light sweet crude benchmark, and the various decisions and implementation of tighter sulfur fuel specs that have been implemented by the IMO over the past 20 years. Do you see a connection, any relationship between the prices and the decisions? So we have, back in 2005, the global sulfur level was capped at 4.5%. In October 2008, IMO announced the timeline for sulfur reductions. Remember, 2008 was historic nominal high crude prices. 2012, the sulfur limit was cut to 3.5. 2016, IMO made the final decision that the 0.5% sulfur cap will indeed be implemented from January 2020, and January 2020, it was implemented. On the lower side, you have the various specification changes, far stricter, that have been happening in the so-called ECA or emission controlled areas. So back to my earlier question, do you see a relationship between generally crude prices and these various steps? The answer is no. There is no relationship. There is also no relationship between the various economic cycles that the globe went through and these various decisions. So what that really underscores is that these are changes that have been driven by environmental considerations, environmental concerns, and have almost been delinked, if you will, from either what is the state of the oil prices or the state of the global economy. In April 2018, as I have highlighted here, IMO then decided that it wants to aim to cut global greenhouse gas emissions from the marine sector by 50% compared with 2008 by 2050. Now, one clear distinction I'd like to highlight is that what you see so far that has happened on this chart since 2005 is a reduction of sulfur levels. What it is aiming for now in the next 30 years or so is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, or basically decarbonization, to remove the carbon and the carbon oxides and monoxides and carbon dioxide that's emitted when a fuel is burnt in a ship. And it's important to understand this distinction, because what has been done so far was very much within the realm of the refining industry, the oil industry, because even as these sulfur limits were being lowered in marine fuel, they had already been lowered much before that in gas oil, for instance, or diesel that we use on the road. So the refiners were already equipped. All that they needed to do is to make sure that they desulfurize the fuel oil part of their refinery output as well. Now, as Douglas has already alluded to this, at the future part, now IMO has not come up with a roadmap. It's aiming to do so, and in phases. It's not looking at the next 30 years as one chunk, but it's from whatever the roadmap that they have set out, it's very, very clearly at least in the initial phases, predicated on technology. So let's be very clear, they're almost not looking to the oil sector anymore. So it's important to understand that, because if you find your oil producers, your refiners a little bit now laid back and perhaps even dismissing or not really taking this seriously, it's because they perhaps will not have a major part to play in what happens in the next 30 years. I'll touch a little bit on IMO 2020. So it was indeed feared to be, that it could turn out to be a hugely disruptive event that would rattle all the players along the chain, from oil refiners to bunker suppliers to anybody in that supply chain, from oil production all the way into shipping, as well as the shipping companies themselves. Now, this is pre-coronavirus. We had already transitioned. We had a January, a full month to see how the transition had happened before the effects of the coronavirus took place. And I would say, and I think the market is generally agreed, that it went through pretty smoothly. So some of the other fears or predictions that had already actually started subsiding by the middle of last year, but they were there nonetheless, that we might see crude spiked above $100. There were predictions of not before ever seen sort of explosion in cracks and premiums of low sulfur fuel oil or premiums of gas oil to fuel oil. None of that happened. I'd just like to flip to the next slide. So this is interesting and connects to a point that I made earlier about, is the oil industry really worried about or thinking even about what happens in the next 30 years in terms of decarbonization? This is a slide from the EIA, which was put up in latter part of last year. As you can see, this is from the AEO 2019 reference case. And the only reason I'm highlighting this is you will see that it goes right until 2050 and doesn't really see much of a change in the fuel mix that the EIA sees. Now, the EIA is the Energy Information Administration of the US. And just to be sure, this chart is only applicable to US bunkering sector. But nonetheless, I think it speaks volumes that they see a very small, a continuing small role for LNG and a continuing big part to be played by distillate fuel and low sulfur fuel oil going all the way into 2050. A quick note about scrubbers and what happened to, as I mentioned, some of the spreads. If we could go on to the third slide, please. So this is the spreads between, this is the fuel oil 0.5 and 3.5%. Sabina, I think it's the next slide which highlights better. Yes, so this is the spread between essentially what the premium that is being commanded by marine fuel 0.5%, which is what ships would need to burn starting January 2020 if they are not equipped with scrubbers, versus 380 CST, 3.5% sulfur fuel oil, which is what all the other ships can, which is what the scrubber equipped ships can burn. So the spread that you are seeing here at one point, I think December 31st, I believe, was probably the highest in the IMO 2020 transition climate, nearly $370 per metric ton. And look how it has crashed. Now, most of that crash is because of the coronavirus. And it's been hovering around just $70 per metric ton. Now, what that means is that the ships that had invested in scrubbers, $2 to $4 million, and were looking and had budgeted based on a 9 to 18 months of return will now have to wait much, much longer. The question then that brings up is, do we expect these spreads to be this low going forward? Now, this is just a characteristic of the oil market. When overall flat prices go down, the premium of the quality premium of any product crunches dramatically as well. So I can perhaps take this a little more detail in the Q&A section. I'm sure there will be a lot of interest in how scrubber economics are working and what is the projection for fuel oil prices. But I'll leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vandana. And I'm going to move straight across to Samir Mohindru, who is a senior editor at S&P Platts. I'm sure many of us receive his updates. Samir has been covering the tanker sector and shipping markets for the last 6 years at Platts. And he's going to give us a little bit of an upview as to kind of the financial health of shipping and kind of what are some of the impacts that we've seen, particularly around COVID-19. So over to you, Samir.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining in today. So at the beginning of the year, we were expecting that the discussion would center around what will happen in the IMO 2020 regime. And the reason why we show this slide here about the fuel oil prices, the spreads between the low sulfur and the high sulfur fuels, is that generally speaking, we make our forecasts, we make our projections, we do our estimates, as we have been doing in case of decarbonization as well. We do it assuming other things remaining the same. But generally these things don't remain same. There are certain disruptions which happen. There are certain unexpected events which happen, as is now happening at the moment. For example, this COVID-19 or coronavirus, call it by any name. And this is what illustrates, and it is an excellent example, a very pertinent one, that if we have to totally decarbonize the shipping industry, then just the industry itself, the shipping industry itself cannot alone do it. There has to be a policy intervention, a regulatory intervention, without which this is not just possible. Just as the coronavirus management is not possible, how to deal with it without a policy or a regulatory intervention. Similarly, in the decarbonization targets as well, how to totally start using the zero emission vehicles, as they say. There has to be a regulatory support, and it has to be at two levels. One, of course, is that, as was the case with IMO, that for desulfurization of the shipping industry, they said that the cutoff date is January 1, 2020. And similarly, a date is already there for cutting emissions by 50% by 2050 for decarbonization and cutting carbon emissions. And for this target to be achieved, the starting point is now. As they say that IMO 2020, that happened, it is done and dusted. What next? So for what next, it is important to start now and to ensure that by 2030, we have a sizable number of ships which are already in this category. And that also brings us back to the coronavirus question, that how it has already affected us and how we should learn lessons from it. And one point which many commoners would have not noticed is that when the crude prices were falling or the product prices were falling, we saw that the shipping freight rates were on the rise in tankers, not in the bulk carriers or in the container sector, but in the tankers, we have seen rates reaching a record high level. And that is also one of the reasons why we are showing this slide, because this shows the fuel oil prices going down. And fuel oil, while it is a cargo which is moved by tankers, it is also a fuel which is used in form of bunkers by the shipping industry itself. And this fall in the fuel oil prices or the bunker prices has ensured that the operating costs of shipping have come down drastically. What they were expecting in an IMO 2020 regime, that there will be a sizable spread between the low sulfur fuel oil and the high sulfur fuel oil, between the marine gas oil and the high sulfur fuel oil. That has not happened. Their operating costs are drastically down, and the demand for these ships has increased so much. And the reason being that the prices of both crude and the products, the refined products, are sharply down, and the general strategy usually for the trading companies is that we are going to buy now and sell later in a contango market, whether it is crude or whether it is products. So these ships are now being used for storage, and storage is one factor. The other is that these ships are laden, but they cannot discharge the cargo. There is a long queue of more than 40 LR2 tankers in Europe itself, which don't have an opportunity to discharge and return for their next voyage. So just to put it in perspective, at the moment, if somebody was to hire an LR2 ship, which carries about 90,000 metric tons of a cargo of jet fuel or gas oil, which is used in automobiles and airlines. So that will cost you $6 million for moving from Persian Gulf to Europe. And $6 million is a number we have never seen. For the last time we saw such a high number, about $5.5 million for an LR2 ship moving from Persian Gulf to Persian Gulf to Europe, was in 2008. Around the Lehman Brothers crash. So these kind of freight rates have also increased the earnings of the shipping companies to levels which were earlier unheard of. There was a time when $100,000 a day earning for a VLCC from Middle East to North Asia, that is considered a kind of a milestone. But now an LR2, an LR1 on similar routes are earning about $100,000 a day. As far as the VLCCs are concerned, their earnings have risen above $200,000 a day. So these numbers indicate that there are opportunities for the shipping industry to improve their financial health, but at the same time, they also raise question marks that how long it is going to last. Usually shipping is a highly volatile and cyclical industry where within a week or within one voyage, the rates turn, and they turn sometimes for the better. But as we have seen in the previous decade, there are many occasions when they turn for the worse. And that is why these earnings are just simply not enough for the shipping industry to make a transition from current regime where the fossil fuels are the order of the day to a fully decarbonized industry in the next 30 years. And that is why, as I mentioned in the beginning of this discussion, that there is a regulatory intervention which will be definitely needed. In what form it will be needed, that is the primary reason why we are here to discuss this and to make a beginning. This is, as was mentioned by Tim earlier, it is first in a series, I presume, that we'll be discussing this decarbonization. And as Douglas mentioned, that the two important aspects, one is the technology, other is the commercial aspect, and the third aspect which Douglas mentioned was this the role of the government and the form in which it has to take. One probably is this carbon price, which the shipping, those ships which continue to use fossil fuels, they have to pay a certain level of cess, which can then be used for funding the research and the utilization of the renewable fuels or the zero carbon fuels. And that is also something which has to be debated, at what will be a tolerable kind of a carbon price which will be acceptable to the shipping industry, because shipping is also divided into sectors, one of them being containers, the other being bulk carriers, the third being tankers, and all of them don't move in tandem. When one of them is improving in terms of the freight rates or earnings or in terms of commercial health, the other is on the decline, as is happening at the moment because of this coronavirus pandemic. While the tankers, which we have already discussed just now, the rates have improved, but the containers industry, which move the FMCG goods, that is on a slowdown, and this trend is going to continue for the rest of the year, because we don't see any near-term revival of container industry. And also there is a slowdown we see in the iron ore and the coal sector, the movement of these goods, the freight is already on the decline because of lower demand, which we see in China. Even if it revives to a marginal extent, that will not be sufficient to improve the earnings to an extent where these sectors can improve themselves. Yeah, so this is a general overview on how we can link the commercial health or the financial health of the shipping industry to the way forward for decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. And that leads us nicely into the panel discussion part of this webcast. Now, you might find it better if you're listening to move into the gallery mode so that you can see all of the panelists if that's not done automatically for you. I'd like to introduce you as well to Mark Florance. Mark is our co-host and has been very active in driving the Chamber's response and information around IMO 2020. So welcome to Mark Florance. Mark sits on the Sustainability and the Energy Committee and active in the SME group as well. So please ask your questions. I see a few questions have come in already. This webcast will be on replay as well. So if you want your name mentioned when you ask your question, just please leave your name there. If you want it to be anonymous, you can ask it anonymously as well. So with that, I just want to go straight into the first question, and that's to Douglas. So Douglas, can we tell what has been the impact of IMO 2020? And this 50% decarbonisation target by 2050 that Samir just spoke about, will that happen? Samir just outlined and Vandana some of the short-term challenges to making that happen. But can we actually tell what the impacts have been and what the impacts of the near-term COVID and oil prices will have on the longer-term targets of IMO? Douglas.
Yeah, when it comes to IMO 2020, I certainly had a very interesting roller coaster ride in the last 2 years, because everybody who I spoke to about IMO 2020 was predicting the apocalypse, technical issues, ships stranded at sea, oil prices and bunker prices going through the roof. Well, to go to the technical challenges first, actually, all the challenges that we predicted in the run-up to 2020 did not materialize at the scale that everybody was envisioning. So in a way, it shows you the incredible adaptability of the shipping industry and the crew on board ships to handle different fuel qualities, different fuel parameters in a fairly safe and responsible manner. When it comes to the bunker prices, of course, nobody could have predicted that COVID-19 and to an extent the politics within the oil markets would have driven oil prices to the prices that they are now. The reality of it is, if you buy bunkers today, it's cheaper than it was 12 months ago. And nobody could have foreseen that. Well, my personal view is at this moment in time that COVID-19 and the oil prices are probably a distortion of the real market moving forwards. And that leads us on to your next question regarding decarbonisation. Yes, it seemed like a big challenge to decarbonise shipping and focus on less energy-intense operations. Will there be respite because of external factors? The answer is most likely no. I mean, a recent article in Lloyd's List already had as a headline that shipping should not bank on the fact that decarbonisation targets will be loosened or deferred. It's a reality that is dawning on shipping. We need to get to grips with it. Short term, that will probably mean through technology means, energy savings devices, energy efficiency, design index improvements, phase 3, phase 4 by 2025, and so forth. And yes, that will reduce carbon intensity, but it will not reduce it to the level that is required by the targets set in 2050. So as we get nearer to 2030, we must see the first vessels coming onto the water that are clearly a non-fossil based or a low carbon based fuel. And that has to happen by 2030 should we want to actually be able to achieve the overall target by 2050. So short-term technology, design indexes, ESDs, etc., wind, sails, whatever, solar, all of that can contribute to a lower carbon intensity, but not enough. We will have to wean ourselves of the drug of choice in shipping, which is fossil fuels at the moment.
Thanks, Doug. Can I ask a question, Tim?
Sure.
Just to follow up on the scrubbers issue and the IMO issue, it's probably a question, I guess, for both Vandana and Samir. The question is, there was a big concern before the regulation came in around IMO that the availability of low sulfur fuel would be limited. And limited because the refineries take some time to put in place the capacity to refine the low sulfur fuel. That, as Doug just mentioned and others have mentioned, doesn't seem to have actually been as big an issue as thought. That's potentially, I guess, because the demand for fuel has gone down generally, because there's less cargo, less shipping, less activity. Do you see a situation where, when post-COVID things start to improve, there's more demand for fuel, that there will be this refining capacity, I guess, deficit on the low sulfur fuel side, and then potentially the spreads will again push out? Maybe Vandana first.
Hi. So I am quite bearish on demand recovery. And if you look, just to put that in context, so we're looking at estimates of close to 30 million barrels per day, or 30% of the global oil demand having evaporated right now. Some of the extreme downward pressure that we've seen on oil prices in recent days has been because of a recalibration of expectations of when we might come out of this trough. Increasingly, it's looking like countries are taking far more cautious steps to exit from the lockdown. So going right into the end of this year, even if you look at the projections of the likes of International Energy Agency, OPEC, or the US EIA, not one is expecting oil demand to recover to pre-COVID levels until December. The current estimates are we might end 2020 with about 9 million barrels per day on average, lower consumption compared with last year. So where does that leave us in terms of fuel availability? There is just a surplus of oil and as a result an surplus of refined products as well. The two are not 100% correlated, obviously, because we are starting to see already refiners reducing their runs because refining margins have been pretty poor as well. So that is in turn crimping supply as well. But going forward, I think the bigger risk that is worth thinking about is what if that we see a widespread bankruptcies and refiners folding up. Now, we have seen waves of that happen previously. It happened post 2008-9 as well. I think the refiners in Europe particularly, which tend to have smaller refineries, very old refineries, they have not invested in those plants for several years. They haven't upgraded them, are particularly vulnerable. But look, this is a fungible market. So if the supply is not sufficient in Europe, because if that happens, because of refinery shutdowns, then there'll be supply available from Russia. Now, available from Asia, sorry, not Russia. So overall in Asia, refiners have upgraded. If you look at Korea, especially India, the new refineries in China are highly complex, very capable of turning the trashiest crudes in the world to the cleanest fuels. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but I don't foresee any significant worry about not enough low sulfur fuel oil being available or MGO. And let's not forget, those back in January when MGO was actually cheaper for a while than LSFO, a lot of ships turned to that as well. So overall, whether it's straight run from the refiners or as a result of blending, I think there's enough capacity that has been put in place now for low sulfur fuel oil to be available.
Okay, thank you, Vandana. And Samir, we've got a question that came up and said, why are we talking about scrubbers now? We talked a lot about scrubbers last year. Can you just answer the question on scrubbers? Are scrubbers now out of the question? Is the payback period just looking too long or impossible?
Yeah, Tim, when it comes to the scrubbers, the initial forecast was that we will have somewhere around 2,500 scrubbers globally, cutting across the shipping industry, all sectors combined. And then when the spreads between the low sulfur and the high sulfur fuel oil, they widened somewhere in the middle of last year, then the projections increased, and there was an actual big interest in getting these installed, and there was a long waiting list also in the shipyards to get this done in the run-up to IMO 2020. But now, as you mentioned, this spread is no longer there, and if at all it is there, it is only to the extent of less than $100 per metric ton. And that is why if somebody had done a back calculation of payback time, the general calculation was depending on whether it's a VLCC or a smaller ship, that they will be able to recover it depending on the price of low sulfur fuel oil, how much premium it will command. They were looking at 1 to 2 years. But at the current spread, if we look at it notionally, now this is not something they are going to recover from that angle. But yes, that said, these ships which had already installed scrubbers or were planning to do so, they already are enjoying a very low bunker fuel costs. And because of that, their operating costs overall are lower. Their earnings are very high because these ships are being used for floating storage. I'm talking about tankers in particular. So they are earning more. Their payback time now is as good as non-existent. They don't need to calculate that. And we have now seen instances where they are even canceling orders.
Wow.
When the COVID-19 happened initially, the concern was that these scrubbers will not be installed on time. In early January, the spreads were pretty high between the two fuel oils. And in the absence of shipyard workers in China and the quarantine, so the waiting period even extended further. But going down the line in February, March, then we noticed that they are now cancelling orders. There are companies which are even saying that you can keep the advance. We are not interested in installing these scrubbers. Instead, we want to do 1 or 2 voyages as long as the rally lasts. And that is why they are going ahead. As of now, the latest numbers we have is that about 4,000 scrubbers have already been installed. Most of them are in bulk carriers and VLCCs. And number 3 comes the product tankers and the chemical tankers. And the projections are that in the next 2 years, this number of 4,000 will be close to 4,200. So that means from now to 2022, there is hardly any interest or new orders being placed. And so the best analogy which is now done of scrubbers is with the catalytic converters of the 1990s, which were installed when petrol desulfurization was taking place in the trucks and the automobiles. So then a period came, then they became history. So the general view now is that in the next few years, we won't be even discussing scrubbers. The only reason they will still exist is that those ships, new buildings, because there is a sizable number of new buildings which have installed scrubbers.
Okay.
So we will continue.
I want to move on. Thank you very much, Samir. I want to move on now and bring Doug back into this and start looking at the decarbonisation question. So IMO 2020 was the start, and Doug, you said that a lot needs to happen, but actually what needs to happen? And perhaps we can start talking about some of the alternative fuels that are available, and perhaps whether you've got a ranking of those fuels. And then afterwards, Doug and Samir jump back in. And I know, thanks for all the questions, everyone. I know Mark is taking a look at those, and we'll ask for next Q&A that comes from the questions that you've asked. But over to you, Doug, kind of what needs to happen by 2030?
Thank you, Tim, for the question. And it's a very pertinent and timely question as well. I think, firstly, to your point, I'm not in the business of ranking fuels. I'm kind of an agnostic person when it comes to fuels. If it works and it meets your requirements as a ship operator, we're cool with it as long as it's technology proven to be useful and it can be used safely and without harm to the environment. We're quite agnostic about that. But I think the context of how we should see this, right? Broadly speaking, when we talk about zero emission fuels, we are talking about bio and renewable. And when I say renewable, and I mean more renewable and synthetic fuels. So renewable electricity fuels such as ammonia, hydrogen, e-methanol, e-gas oil. In terms of biomethanol, biomass, all of them have a part to play. The only question is how long? For example, we look at methanol, it still has a carbon molecule in it. So yes, it might be a lower carbon fuel and perhaps the total life cycle emissions are lower of methanol, but it still has carbon in it. The same with LNG. We currently use LNG and a lot of ship operators are quite enamored with LNG because by using it, you reduce your carbon footprint by 20%, discounting methane slip, for example. But longer term, 20% is not enough. So then there's people saying, well, okay, what about black LNG turning into green LNG? Black LNG is the current LNG that we get from the industry. And green energy, LNG would be, for example, from biomass derived LNG. Well, the question is that transition over the next 15 years a reality? Because the LNG that we use today is abundant. Green LNG is not abundant. It's kind of a niche product. So the question is, can the industry bank on the fact that there will be enough green LNG to go around in 10, 15 years' time to transition to an even lower carbon intense form of operations? Finally, and then I'll close my point on this, we should understand that IMO at the moment only looks at carbon emissions from an operational perspective, meaning at the ship's operating envelope. It does not take into account total life cycle emissions. So for example, whatever fuel we use, does it have an upstream negative impact? Either if we start using a lot of a certain fuel, will it create carbon elsewhere in the value chain? So currently IMO is doing a study to look at total life cycle emissions, understanding the impact of a chosen fuel and where carbon emissions might be negatively impacted elsewhere. There's no point in burning a lower carbon fuel at a ship whilst increasing carbon emissions elsewhere. And I think that is an important development that will definitely be thrown into the mix for ship operators to consider within the next 5 to 10 years.
Doug, can I ask a follow-up question? And that is, and this is a question also from Peter Godfrey. The question is, what will drive this change? Now, obviously, as you say, there's no silver bullet, which is a bit of a shame, but one will emerge, I'm sure, as time moves on, as technology changes. But obviously you mentioned regulatory, a few of the panelists have mentioned regulatory impetus will be the driver for this going forward. There's two aspects to this question. The first is, what is that regulation? Presumably it's a carbon price. What will the carbon price be? And to Peter's question, do you think that post the pandemic that there'll be more impetus for regulatory support for carbon decarbonisation or less, both here and globally?
I think that there's a short answer to it and there's a long-winded answer to it. Let me shortly just make it very clear. Carbon intensity is what it's all about. We should not focus on the 50% reduction in 2050 because that is an arbitrary aggregate number that comprises an entire industry sector, in this case shipping. But carbon intensity is an absolute measure. We will have to reduce our carbon intensity. And with that, I mean, per cargo carried ton nautical mile, the CO2 has to reduce. For example, if we want to achieve the stated goals in 2050, we must reduce our carbon intensity by 60 to 90% aggregate across the industry. And I believe that that is where IMO will start tightening the targets. So short, medium to short term, things like energy efficiency, technology improvement, together with fossil fuels, yes, we will knock off a few percentage points in carbon intensity. But to achieve a longer term reduction, we must move to lower and zero carbon fuels. And that discussion will be driven by carbon intensity targets and measures that will tighten over time. And we should not forget, shipping cannot do this voluntarily because the business case in a business as usual scenario does not exist. So that's why we need carbon pricing.
Yeah, which you got an idea what that price might be to make it viable at this point?
Well, if I could answer that question, I would probably not be in this webinar and sitting on a beach somewhere, because could make a lot of money if you could do price predictions. But as it stands now, technology, for example, with bio, we know that if we have a carbon tax, or let's say a carbon cost of, let's say, $50 to $100, then bio becomes viable. For electro-based fuels, such as e-methanol, e-ammonia, we're looking at a carbon price of about $200 to $300 to make those renewable electricity fuels viable, either on par, no favorable or less favorable than a fossil-based fuel. But again, that is just based on the here and now. In the future, fuel prices will evolve. So this will always be what I would say a floating carbon price discussion, really, at the time that it's been held.
Okay, and just so to answer Peter's question, post-pandemic, do you think this pandemic will have a positive or negative impact on the attitude towards regulatory drive on this particular point?
I would say no, it will not have an impact whatsoever. IMO will not budge or change its strategy to the industry because it's sympathetic to short-term shocks or short-term distortions. So the answer is no.
Okay. The other questions that come through, and quite a few questions, is when do you think this will all start? Obviously, it has to happen by 2030 in your view for mid-2050 targets. So obviously, new builds now need to consider how this is done, what they should be putting on their ships. Now, there's obviously, do you go for an electric motor at some point? Obviously, electric motors take less maintenance than ICEs, for example, but then again, you need some sort of fuel which would work with electric motors. So it's obviously, as you mentioned, there's a lot of choices, so it's quite hard for ship owners at the moment to make a decision as to how they might move forward when they're building new ships. Now, obviously, there's got to be two aspects. This one is new ships and old ships. What fuel can you use existing engines to make them less carbon? So what do you think is going to be the transition between now and 2030?
I think it's highly dependent on what trade you are in. Like, for example, battery or fuel cells, for example, might be a good option for short sea applications. Let's say a ferry from Singapore to Batam, for example, augmented LNG fuel with a battery-powered or battery-augmented solution. You can reduce your carbon footprint that way. But for deep-sea shipping, currently, it will probably be less of an effective solution other than perhaps driving auxiliary energy on board ship. We're looking at, for example, ammonia. Ammonia is kind of a proven fuel. It can be worked. And in fact, some of the engine manufacturers are looking to have their engines fully ammonia fuel ready by 2024. So the challenge is then, okay, but ammonia takes about 3 times the space of conventional fuel oil. So what impact does that have on my ship's design? Or shall I just bunker more often? What does that mean for my trading pattern? So it is not as simple as saying, hey, give me a ship with a zero or low carbon fuel. It really is dependent on trading patterns. What business are you in? And how often or how not often you can bunker. And that is also a function of cargo carrying capacity. You do not wish to compromise too much of your income generating opportunities of a ship at the benefit of more costly bunkers that actually don't give you any incremental benefit of income.
Okay, so I guess whatever fuel we choose going forward, it seems at least in the short term, it's going to be more expensive. It'll be more expensive. So actually the question I guess for Samir here is who's going to pay the price of this, Samir? How shipping will go up, and obviously the same I guess issue we had with IMO 2020. We were all concerned it would push up prices of shipping and therefore push up prices of consumer goods. That hasn't happened because COVID's come in, so the impact's been lessened. But how do you see going forward who's going to be paying for this additional cost of shipping, and what impact will that have on the shipping industry?
Yes, that is a very tricky question, Mark, because for shipping, as we discussed in the beginning, it is a very volatile and cyclical industry, and they are a bit resistant when it comes to extra expenses on which they don't get the returns. That is why they are always looking at moving to ships which have better engines, where the fuel consumption is lesser. For example, the transition has already been made from the non-eco to eco ships, where the consumption of fuel is lesser. For example, in a VLCC, a laden VLCC carrying a cargo, if it's an eco VLCC, it will consume maybe about 55 tons of fuel oil in a day. And if it is a non-eco one, it will consume 70 tons. So it's a hell of a lot of a difference when there are 15 to 20 tons extra they have to consume. And that is why the general impression which we get from the shipping industry is that even if our earnings at a given point of time, for example, now the earnings are very good. So these earnings may not last even the next few months. So one proposal, as Douglas has also mentioned, is a carbon price. And there was a study which was done by Lloyd's register in which they said that, okay, we would be accepting up to $50 kind of a per ton kind of a carbon price. And these are the kind of innovative or out of the box strategies which have to be done in order to fund these kind of new fuels, which are, I would say, the zero carbon fuels. That is a better term to use at the moment. That is the only way out. Otherwise, from earnings point of view, that study which Lloyd's Register mentioned, it also says about that the passing the cost in the supply chain will be critical for these fuels to be acceptable. And the voyage cost, how much that voyage cost is very critical. That is why these members of the shipping industry were also apprehensive about the implementation of the IMO 2020, that the bunker cost will be very high. But as Douglas had said, the bunker prices now are much lower than what they were a year ago. So we have to find a way out in terms of a fund or a special kind of a tax which can address this issue.
Yeah, I guess ultimately industry will adjust. The next question is from Tommy Tan, and he's asked, and this is a very good question, and I guess it's probably for Vandana initially, who are we expecting to build infrastructure to supply the alternate fuels, e.g. ammonia, and can the bunker imports ramp up fast enough to do this?
Could I just do a quick time check? Sorry, Vandana, because we're up to the hour. We are going to go over. It's very difficult to answer all the questions on decarbonising shipping within 1 hour, which is why we have some follow-up workshops. But we will be going over by approximately 15 minutes. So please stay online. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. And we're going to touch on some other areas as well. But I just wanted to thank everybody if anyone is leaving now, but please stay on and we'll answer more of your questions. So apologies for interrupting, Vandana, but perhaps you could go ahead. Thank you.
So sorry, I lost my train of thought there, Mark. Very quickly, the question was about who will make the investment?
No, who built the infrastructure to supply the fuels?
Oh, exactly. That's spot on. When it comes to LNG, for instance, a lot of thought has been given to who should be building that infrastructure. And typically in the oil and gas industry, the infrastructure building, because it has to be a common carrier access principle typically to work, it falls on the government. And some of the questions here have also touched upon. So, what will drive the oil industry or shipping industry or anybody to make these changes for decarbonization? If it's left to market forces, none of these elements will. It has to come as a regulation, I believe. But when it comes to infrastructure, and again, if you look at some of the oil companies, they're all going at different speeds when it comes to decarbonization. If you look at the oil majors, for instance, Shell is in one basket, I would put it, and somebody like ExxonMobil in a completely different one.
I guess, Doug, you want to weigh in on this because it depends on the fuel chosen as to how they move forward.
Yeah, I think Vandana made a very good point that regulation and policy is really what will drive the infrastructure. So, for example, and I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but in Australia, we know that there's a big push for e-hydrogen, renewable electrical, produced hydrogen. Hydrogen in itself can be used as a fuel. However, it's technically prohibitive because of the high pressures and low temperatures that it needs to be stored. But hydrogen can be turned into renewable ammonia, and ammonia is a liquid. So, for example, ammonia could be shipped to a variety of ports around the world, be stored, and effectively delivered. However, will ships voluntarily choose ammonia as a fuel? Probably not. But, for example, a port like Rotterdam or Singapore, they could consider, okay, as a green port initiative, we want ships to go green. We will import ammonia, which is a hydrogen carrier, and we can give ships the opportunity to start burning ammonia, for example. That is a real life fictitious example that I would like to pull out, but it's probably not far from the truth. That's probably how we're going to get there, because the market itself will not voluntarily move in that direction because the financial incentives are simply not there at present to facilitate the demand for supply to become on stream.
Interesting, I heard out of Australia that someone has claimed to at least developed a mechanism to store hydrogen at low pressure.
Yeah.
So if that was something that could be commercially viable, then that could be change the whole game, right? Exactly. Actually, there's another question from Peter Godfrey, and this one is to you again, Doug, and it's about nuclear. Obviously nuclear is a good fuel for ships in the sense that it lasts a long time or other issues. What's the response of the industry to that now?
I think nuclear in itself, and if you take politics away from it, it's actually a very good fuel. That's why in the Navy we use nuclear submarines, etc. And to give you a flavor of how powerful nuclear could be, and don't quote me on the numbers, but I think somebody mentioned to me that a medium-sized container ship can travel 1,500 nautical miles on 2.1 grams of uranium. That's a couple of sand, bites, and only be left with 1.6 grams of enriched uranium, which can be regenerated by adding more uranium, etc. So from an efficiency point of view, it's ultra efficient. The challenge is, of course, is how do we, as shipping, which is an international business, allow member states to deal with this idea that commercial ships are nuclear driven. So I would suggest from a theoretical utopian point of view, nuclear is great, but from a political and policy perspective, I would say the challenges are insurmountable to become a mainstay in commercial shipping.
Actually, I've heard there's other options for different types of nuclear fuels to be used that's been developing as well, but of course all these things are still in the stages. Okay, this is a question for Samir. What carrots do you think the shipping industry needs in order to move forward on this particular point, to decarbonise?
Yeah, for one thing in particular they need is a good infrastructure. For example, if they have to bunker on a particular kind of a fuel, there has to be a guarantee that this fuel will be available at places where they are going to berth or they are going to load or unload cargoes, and that facility is not available, then they are not going to adopt that fuel, say hydrogen or ammonia or biofuel. So these fuels can only find their way into the shipping, heart of the shipping industry, if there is enough infrastructure available at the ports, number one. Number two, there is a regular supply chain. There is a pipeline for the enough production of these fuels are made at regular intervals and supplied. So for example, now when the IMO 2020 issue came up, one apprehension was that there will not be enough low sulfur fuels available. And that is why they started doing storage of marine gas oil, that at some point we will need it. So why not keep it in advance? But in reality, what happened was that most of the refineries had done their outages or maintenance well in advance. Usually they would do it, say, in the middle of the year. They did it in the first quarter, and they did longer maintenance. They tweaked their run rate systems so that enough of these fuels are produced and are available at the main bunkering ports. And that is primarily the reason. Even if this COVID-19 had not happened, one of the questions our sources were asking, what if COVID-19 had not happened? Even then, there was a very strong chance that the differential between these fuels would have been much lower than what was projected. So coming back to your question, Mark, that what exactly the carrots they need in terms of the shipping industry in a free market world, there are not enough subsidies which can be provided to them. But if there is a fuel which is provided at reasonable rates at which their own rate of returns or earnings are not affected. The voyage cost, which is mentioned in the Lloyd register study, that voyage cost is critical. And that is why even now when they talk about LNG, we noticed that the number of ships which have adopted scrubbers is 4,000, because they know they can get the high sulfur fuels some way or the other. But the number of ships which are LNG ready or are already using LNG are hardly 500. The concern is that we may not get LNG bunkering at a given port. Then what will we do? So yeah, the main issue is enough supply at all the major ports at regular intervals.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's come through about the availability of biofuels. And obviously biofuels is an interesting aspect and is very climate friendly, but there are other sides to it. In obviously food crops and so on are the big issue that comes up. Can I ask you this question, Vandana? What do you think about the bioavailability?
It's interesting. By and large, biofuels, the advent of biofuels has also been driven by regulation, not market forces. If you remember in 2008, when again we saw nominal record high oil prices, a lot of biofuels actually became a good thing to do, and a lot of projects were put in place because they were just viable. Regulation or no regulation, biofuel was cheaper, even the first generation biofuel. And as prices crashed in the financial crisis, a lot of those projects fell by the wayside, some of them prominently here in Singapore as well. After that, we've generally seen quite a patchy track record for biofuels, and every time oil prices take a step down, so they took that happened in 2014 to 16, and now again, it serves quite a hammering blow generally on biofuels. So what that has done in turn is that the efforts that had come underway to move from first generation biofuels, which as you mentioned, create a lot of problems with regards to food crops, to second generation and third generation biofuels, a lot of those efforts have also fallen by the wayside. So, you know, unless, I really don't see anything giving biofuels a huge tailwind for the time being. So if you are asking, could that be a potential wonderful solution to decarbonize the sector. No, not unless some sort of huge penalties on using, carbon pricing and so on using fossil fuel makes biofuels viable. I think they'll have to start the whole process of innovation in biofuels has had a major setback as well. So in some ways, it'll have to start from square one.
Okay, thank you. We've got two final questions because we need to wrap up. And so brief answers, please. But the first one is to Doug, and that is, what do you see about the availability of finance for this trip to a net zero?
That's a very interesting question, and I don't want to be too speculative about it, but I think something along the lines of green bonds must enter the equation at some point in time. For example, in the community readiness piece, we already have banks using the Poseidon principles to measure the sustainability of their loan book in terms of assets, how green are they, et cetera, et cetera. And that has a profound implication that for further loans by investment banks or leasing companies to be given to ship operators, there has to be some kind of mechanism to fund that CapEx investment to build that new technology ship that can handle the fuel of the future. So I think some form of green bond financing or a similar kind of instrument will probably become more and more prevalent in the markets.
Okay, great. Last question is, I guess one of the reasons we've talked about IMO in this podcast was, one, it was a follow-up to our previous event, but more importantly, I think it demonstrated that although there was a lot of predictions of doom and gloom when this was implemented, actually reality was quite different. And I think one of the things, and this is a question, someone suggested that blending was a lifesaver there. Is some sort of blending of fuels going forward in a transition type mode probably the more likely way this will happen? Or is that not possible?
That question directed to me, Mark?
I don't know who's the best to answer that. I guess it may be you.
Well, or Vandana, I'm open.
Vandana, maybe you'd like to answer it then.
I guess you're talking about ships that can burn different types of fuels. So,
well, obviously there's blending of low sulfur and high sulfur to achieve the goals they needed. But going forward, I guess, given there's different types of fuels will become available at lower carbon, maybe they'll blend it in. This is a very hard question to answer because we're not sure what type of fuel we're talking about. But I guess blending of some sort of like biofuel, for example, might blend that with low sulfur fuel if it's possible.
Yeah. I mean, I can briefly answer that question. When we talk about bio in its conventional way, we're talking fatty acid methyl ester, which is 0 carbon, 0 sulfur. And what you find now is that most governments promote the blending of FAME in a conventional hydrocarbon. So it stands to reason, the more FAME you blend in a hydrocarbon, the lower the carbon intensity of that fuel will become. Is that for shipping a sustainable development? It depends. Shipping will compete with other markets for their fair share of biomaterial. So in a longer term period, I do not believe there's enough bio to go around to fulfill the insatiable appetite of ships' fuel for the industry.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Tim?
Thank you very much, Mark, for helping me out with the questions there and for planning this webcast with the committee. I'd like to thank, first of all, our sponsor, the Fry Group, and I'd also like to thank the 3 panelists who joined Mark and I on the session today. One of the things we like to do as a chamber is do the networking. That's obviously very challenging now, but we've certainly made the connections. So if you're interested in this topic, we've certainly linked you to the experts in the field here in Singapore that you can follow up with, and I'm sure that they would all welcome questions or your inquiries. We will, on that vein, be following up, as I mentioned at the beginning, with the Energy Institute, and we'll be running some sessions which will be available to BritCham members on technology, infrastructure readiness, community readiness. We'll be touching on cyber security and data, which we didn't talk about at all today. and the investment and finance readiness, and also the future of autonomous shipping, which is another area that we didn't mention. So there are some upcoming events, and part of that, I did mention that today was the launch of our Net Zero, the Pathway to Net Zero by the Chamber. You can see there will be more information coming out about that. There'll be a questionnaire which will be sent out to everybody, and we welcome everybody's views on that questionnaire. Please fill that in, and that will guide a lot of the net zero activities that will happen in the coming year. So we appreciate all of that. There'll also be a feedback form, but you can see there on the screen the activities that are coming up. So I won't read them all out now on the basis of time, but the Chamber has adapted really to kind of, in this COVID environment, to make sure that we remain relevant and bring you the right content through the various platforms that are available. So with that, just once again, I just want to thank everybody. If you've got questions to the Fry Group, you can ask them there on the screen. If you've got questions for the committee, you can get in touch either via your committee member or any of us here. So with that, from the Energy Utilities, from the Transport and from the Sustainability Committee, thank you very much, everybody, once again, including the panelists, and have a good day and be safe. Thank you.